Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, May 23rd, 2025, and our friend Ambassador Chas Freeman is back with us. Welcome back, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you.
Ambassador, I want to zoom out today and focus on. I know that you're so much involved in whatever comes from China toward the United States and the policies of the United States toward China. When it comes to China and the grand policy of the United States, grand strategy of the United States, how do you see? Do you feel that John Mearsheimer somehow is right, and after all, they're gonna clash, they're gonna fight each other in a brutal war, or there has to be something in between, some sort of understanding between the two important and major superpowers?
Well, the answer to that would lie in effective statecraft and diplomacy from both sides. I see statecraft and diplomacy being skillfully practiced by the Chinese. I don't see that from the United States. And in fact, the Department of State, which is the policy-making body that monitors and manages relations with foreign countries, whether they're enormously strong, powerful countries like China or Brazil, or whether they're Malta or the Seychelles or Maldives, um, is being dismantled, and it is headed by people who have no experience dealing effectively in international relations. So the immediate prospect is not good. I think John Mearsheimer is quite correct in his theory in describing the United States and other European or European related countries. That is to say, we do react as Graham Allison described in his Thucydides trap idea. We do react militarily. We try to oppose the rise of others. We insist on hegemony. That is our history. It derives from Europe. I don't think it applies really very well in East Asia. Pacific Asia never had, or I should say not never, but for 2 millennia, it has not had warring states, which are typical of Europe. I mean, Europe is full of little countries relatively small countries that have been at war with each other for much of history. That's not been the pattern in Pacific Asia. It has been the pattern in India, by the way. India, like Europe, is an extension of the Eurasian landmass, a peninsula. It has had this same kind of pattern of states contending with each other by whatever means they can come up with, very Machiavellian. Actually, the Indians outdo Machiavelli in their own. They make him look like a very devout Christian. But I think my problem with John Mearsheimer's theory is that I think it is a strategic theory that does not take account of cultural factors, geography, and history adequately. So if you look at Pacific Asia, what you'll find is historically there was this enormous culturally preeminent, scientifically preeminent, best governed state called China. It went through it had different constitutional orders, constitutional order equating to a dynasty. And it was often ruled by foreigners for the last 1,000 years, the most recent 1,000 years. For 600 years, it was ruled by foreigners. This is a very different pattern than Europe. Countries around China all engaged in state trade with it, which we describe as tribute. Something like, President Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE. They all did nice things for him because they want to be on his right side. But they also did things with an economic motive. They hoped to make money by what they were doing. I think the pattern in Pacific Asia just is not doesn't fit the Mearsheimer or the Allison theory very well. But of course, he has described our behavior very well. And I think we are very foolishly leading with our chin. And I think we're going to get, we very likely we are going to get into a war. And we're going to be very sorry about that because we're not going to win it. We can talk about why, but the main thing is instead of almost a sociopathic or a psychotic approach to China, which says, we can't tolerate the rise of China. It will do exactly what we did. That is, it will try to become a global hegemon. We didn't intend to do that originally. If you look at the 19th century, you'll find Americans constantly saying, well, we will never be imperialists. And of course, at the end of the century, we became imperialists. And after World War II, we occupied the whole world outside the Soviet bloc and China and North Korea, North Vietnam. And so I think we mirror our image. We look at the Chinese and we imagine that they are like us, and they're not. They have a different history. They have a different geography. They have different relationships with their neighbors. And what they want is different. What they want is deference, respect. And that is particularly the case because the arrival of the West on their doorstep about 500 years ago, Macau dates to about 1519. That was the earliest Portuguese Empire intrusion into China. The Dutch occupied Taiwan. The French tried to take it from the Chinese. Europeans divided China into spheres of influence. And I say Europeans, I include the Russians in that because they took a lot of territory from China. And they also insisted on special rights in places like Xinjiang and Manchuria, Mongolia. So I think you need to look at the history and derive your theory from that. I don't think one theory of foreign affairs fits all cases. But, I'm very worried about where we are heading, not so much because of what the Chinese are doing, because I think they're very risk averse. They don't want a war. But there are people in the United States who are gearing up for war and trying to invent reasons to go to war with China.
You mentioned that the United States is not going to win a war with China, and when it comes to the reasons of the way that you're talking about that, do you think that how can we bring the Trump factor in the equation in the way that the United States right now is deciding about the policies, the main policies of the United States or China? How do you see that?
Well, I think Mr. Trump is a wild card in any game. There is no effective, orderly policy process in Washington anymore on either international or domestic affairs. He is served by people who are, frankly, mostly unqualified for the positions they have been put into. Maybe they'll learn on the job and perform well, but that's not likely. So Mr. Trump he makes decisions, and it's not clear whether I know that we know that he loves money, like Willie Sutton as the bank robber. He wants to go where the money is. For Willie Sutton, that was the banks. For Donald Trump, that's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE. That's where the money is. But does he think strategically, or is that all that there is to him? And his approach to China has been driven mainly by Peter Navarro, who is an economist who graduated from Harvard. A little hard to see how he did, given what he believes. His theories are derided. They're regarded as a joke by most economists. And he believes that China has exploited the United States terribly. So he objects to the fact that the United States pays China for all kinds of goods and services by printing money. We don't actually export enough to China. Why is that? It is not because China has a high tariff wall, or it's not even that the Chinese are not like the Japanese and Koreans who don't want to buy foreign products. The Chinese love foreign products. But we are not producing the sorts of things that affect goods. Services are a different matter. We have a trade surplus with China. They pay a lot of money for licensing American technology. And now, of course, we're trying to cut them off from that technology. So this doesn't make any sense at all. And if you look at the two countries, China has about something more than 4 times as many people as the United States, but it only has 7% of the world's water, and we've got almost a fourth of that. It has 1/3 the arable land, agricultural land, that the United States does. On that, it must support 4 times as many people. If we had the same ratio between people and arable land in the United States, there would be 4 billion people living in the United States. And we would behave very differently than we now do, if that were the case. But the other part of this is it makes enormous sense for China to buy American or Brazilian agricultural products. I mean, Brazil is in much the same position as the United States. It's rich in resources. It has a lot of arable land. And it could create even more by doing terrible things to the forests in Brazil. So if you ask yourself, well, how should you manage this? Let's say, I know you're Muslim, but let's use the example of pork. If you grow pigs, hogs, it's much more efficient to do that in Brazil or the United States than it is to do it in China, because that consumes a lot of grain, it consumes a lot of water. You should do it on this side of the Pacific, not the other side. And the same is true of a lot of things. So the trade theories that this administration are following are basically a demonstration that they don't agree with David Ricardo about comparative advantage and how trade works. They don't agree with Adam Smith. They basically repudiated all the classic economists. And this, they're entitled to do that if they want, but we're seeing that their theories don't work. The uncertainty that the tariff policy has created, the shortages that have been created are causing all kinds of effects. In the United States, small businesses, which had depended on Chinese imports, are now going out of business. Not only going out of business, but because the owners, the entrepreneurs who started those businesses may have mortgaged their house as collateral, as security for the loans that they took out to start their business, they're going to lose their houses. They're going to be homeless. And they can't make any decisions because they don't know from one moment to the next what the tariff rate will be and what Mr. Trump will do or not do. And of course, the government, the U.S. government, is being impartially dismantled. For example, if you're a farmer, the Weather Service now cannot provide you with the information it used to because it's lost staff and it's lost funding and so forth and so on. So the United States is engaged in a very peculiar self-sabotage, and the Chinese are not. And there is a very interesting phenomenon now, which the Economist, the magazine, most important, best written conservative magazine in the English speaking world, which they've finally noticed, and that is Chinese technology is now spectacular. It's not just high-speed trains or electric cars or solar installations or wind power installations or nuclear power construction or hydroelectric power or electrification or urbanization, architecture, construction techniques. It's amazing. And so we now have the phenomenon of vloggers, people who use video to blog, going to China and taking photos of amazing things that don't exist in the West. So China's gaining admirers, even as the United States alienates other countries. Now, if there were a war, of course, the war would be 7,000 or 8,000 miles away from the United States. We would have to project power against the Chinese, who would be fighting on their own territory, or in the case of Taiwan, within 100 miles of the mainland of China. The first thing that would happen would be the devastation of Taiwan. It would lose both its democracy and its industrial base and its prosperity. And therefore, if the purpose of the war were to protect Taiwan, that purpose would be overcome just by having a war. This is without getting to the point that a war, if the United States strikes the Chinese homeland, the Chinese will strike the American homeland. And that might start with conventional weapons, but it could very rapidly escalate to the nuclear level. So this is no joke. I think there's an assumption in the United States, unstated presupposition, that because the Korean War and the Vietnam War were fought in Asia, they were limited wars. This could be, and China was involved in both. A war with China would be limited and take place only in Asia. But that's nonsense. These were third countries. Those were proxy wars. We were very careful not to strike the Chinese mainland. We didn't even make much use of Taiwan in the Cold War in Vietnam or in the Vietnam War. It was basically used for logistical support and nothing else, no bombing or whatever. So I think we have a very distorted view of China and a very mistaken view of what would happen if we got into a war. And I don't think we have effective diplomacy to prevent a war. There is no effective dialogue between the American and Chinese foreign policy establishments. The congressmen and women who talk about China have never been there. They talk about the Chinese Communist Party. I don't think they've ever met a communist. They probably imagine that if you've seen one communist, you've seen them all. And they are going off what they remember of the late Soviet Union. When they talk to the Vietnamese, who are communists, very similar to the Chinese, that is, they're run by a communist party. They're not ideologically communist. They have industrial policies which mirror those of China and have been very effective. When they talk to the Vietnamese, they don't think about them as communists because they're not, because they're anti-Chinese. Therefore, there can't be communists. So this is all really, in my view, better explained by psychology than by strategy. And the fact that around 1870, the United States became the world's largest and most advanced economy by stages, and that it dominated the 20th century. The fact that this is not true anymore, that China's economy produces 3 times as many goods as ours. 1/3 of the world's manufacturing is in China. 15% is in the United States. I don't know the percentage in Brazil, but it must be considerably less. And, the Chinese military is now formidable. And they just showed that in the Indo-Pakistan War. The J-10C Chinese fighter, export model fighter, apparently was successful against the French Rafale. which is a very advanced fighter. And so, this is not a good bet to go to war with China. There's no reason for it, really. And the outcome is unlikely to be anything we like.
If we consider the behavior of Donald Trump and his administration since they took power, they started with the tariff war, and which didn't work. Then Trump tried to back down somehow and saying that we're gonna get along with each other. And right now, it's something so strange is the Golden Dome. Many people are just making jokes about Golden Dome, but when it comes to China, I think nobody would imagine that Russia or Iran would attack the United States. The only reason, I think, in the mind of the Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, the only country that they may have some sort of fear of would be China. That's why they're thinking of Golden Dome. How do you see the way that Chinese are thinking about the Golden Dome and the new sort of policy on the part of Donald Trump and on the Trump administration?
Well, of course, when you propose something like that, which theoretically could eliminate China's capacity to deter an American attack, because if there were an effective cover for the United States, like the proposed Golden Dome, we wouldn't have to worry about a Chinese counterattack. You start doing that, and immediately the Chinese start thinking about ways to counter the Golden Dome. So you get into an arms race. And that is exactly what is in prospect. In fact, it's already happening in many ways. The United States is undergoing a $1 trillion nuclear weapons modernization program, again aimed at China. This has provoked the Chinese into greatly expanding their nuclear forces. They've gone from a very modest level of nuclear armament, a couple of hundred warheads, and now they're headed toward apparently 1,500, 1,500 warheads. And these are, some of them mounted on hypersonic platforms, missiles, or other kinds of missiles, which are not interceptable by any known technology. And in fact, one of the reactions by the Chinese, not official, but Chinese military thinkers in response to Golden Dome is, why not put nuclear weapons in space ready to come down on the United States if it misbehaves? So this is all madness. And we need to remember that the only way that a war with China would ever start is if a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue, meaning the Chinese Civil War, the unfinished Chinese Civil War, which the U.S. intervened to prevent finishing. If we get into a fight over that, then very quickly we get into an exchange of fire between the Chinese homeland and the American homeland. And, and the fact that there is no escalation control at all. There are no understandings. There is no dialogue about how to prevent escalation to the nuclear level between the United States and China is very, very dangerous. During the Cold War, we had a very elaborate and frequent dialogue with the Soviet Union on these questions. We had arms control proposals. Well, we have no such thing with the Chinese. And I would have to say, looking at the conflicts around the world, there is no coherent U.S. proposal for an end to the Ukraine war. The United States is a participant in that war with Ukraine. Yes, a proxy participant, mostly. But Ukraine can't do various things without direct American support, and it has had that. So we are a co-belligerent in that war. But now we're pretending to be a mediator between Ukraine and Russia. Well, the two roles are not compatible. Trump went to West Asia, to the Arabian Peninsula, Persian Gulf, he claimed he got a lot of commitments or pledges or indications of transfer of capital to the United States. Maybe there's something to that. Maybe it's just a pipe dream. I don't know, but anyway, he didn't apparently talk very much about the genocide in Gaza. There isn't any American proposal on Gaza other than his Gaza Riviera proposal, which basically endorses the genocide and involves removing all the Palestinians from Gaza and putting Gaza under American control. There's not even an effective plan for providing humanitarian assistance to Gaza as babies die by the hundreds and thousands from starvation. The Israelis are still claiming there's no starvation in Gaza, but by doing that, they're simply demonstrating once again that what they say is seldom true. More often than not, it's a lie. Look at the situation with Iran. There is no coherent proposal there. I know Aragchi has recently expressed some optimism about the possibility of the Rome meetings leading to something. I take that as the normal behavior of a professional diplomat. You are always optimistic in public about the possibility of a resolution. But I also noted that the Supreme Leader laughed at Mr. Witkoff's statement that Iran couldn't have any enrichment capability at all. So where's the coherence to that approach? Is there a strategy? I don't see one. When we talk about the relationship between the United States and Russia, the United States and China, or for that matter, the United States and India, these are great powers, or the United States and Japan. Japan is about to re-engage with the United States on the tariff issue, which it is very upset about, naturally. I don't know what will come of that. The last Japanese effort to negotiate with the United States left the Japanese unsure what the American position was and how to accommodate it. So what is happening is, as the United States is dismantling the competence of its own government, it is behaving in an erratic manner, both domestically and internationally. It is doing grave strategic damage to itself. For example, the attack on Harvard. Harvard has, for a long time, been rated as the top university in the world. And the latest list from evaluating universities in terms of their scientific and technological prowess still puts Harvard at the top of the list. MIT is 10th. Numbers 2 through 9 are Chinese. This is a change in the world. I'd argue in the end, contrary to what John Mearsheimer predicts and what Graham Allison identifies as the Thucydides trap, the United States really has a great deal to gain from leveraging Chinese prosperity and progress. The more prosperous China is, the more it can buy from the United States, or Brazil for that matter. It's a good thing for China to become prosperous. The more technologically advanced it becomes, the more we need to collaborate with it if we are to advance ourselves. So I think our policies are, frankly, very self-destructive and very dangerous.
I think the point that you've raised is so much important, Ambassador, because you look at the China's behavior in Africa, in Asia, in South Asia, it's all about that, helping the other nations to build up, to getting better. In order, they want to replace the United States. They know that the United States, somehow they have some sort of fear from the United States, cutting everything from them. That's why they're trying to find alternatives for their market. Do they really move in that direction?
These relationships, trade and investment relationships, are driven less by China than by the other countries involved. You look at the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, the projects that emerge from that, and I should describe the Belt and Road Initiative. Belt and Road Initiative essentially is the empowerment of China's policy banks that have state lending capacity to lend to projects that create connectivity in a constructive way. But there is no office in Beijing that says what these projects should be. They follow the dictum of the late Deng Xiaoping. You cross the river by feeling the stones with your feet. So the government says to people, we want you to, help Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and and if you produce projects that are good for the Congo and good for us, we'll give you the money for that. But we're not going to tell you what to do in the Congo or how to do it or anything else. And we're certainly not going to tell the Congo what it should do. We're not in that business. So this is a very commercial sort of approach. Of course, the Chinese want to make money. The Chinese state-owned companies, Chinese private companies, construction companies, they want to make money. But they know that if they design a project in the right way, they can get state backing for it, both diplomatic backing and, far more important, financial backing. And this is how it works. But the United States has no similar mechanism. We say to our companies, we'd like you to do more in Africa. Then they say, okay, who's going to pay for it? And we don't have an answer. So this is a competition that is stacked in favor of the Chinese. And what is the objective of the Belt and Road Initiative? It is basically to remove all the barriers to movement of goods and services in the entire Eurasian landmass, and at least East Africa. Of course, Latin America has now signed up in many cases, not Brazil, but signed up to this project. So Chile, for example, is exploiting this. So the Chinese get a lot out of that because Latin America is very wealthy in resources. I mentioned water, you could say agriculture, you could say mining, you could say this, that, and the other, and increasingly industrial things. That's why, producing electric cars, Chinese electric cars in Brazil makes sense. That's a wise decision on the part of Brazil. Take the old Ford factory and turn it over to a Chinese company to produce electric cars. The United States has banned Chinese electric cars. This is stupid. So I salute Brazil. You guys are smart.
Ambassador, I talk with Colonel Jacques Beau. Every week. I talk with him on Mondays. He said something somehow different from what we've seen from the West in Africa. He said when he was working for NATO in Africa, and he said China came to Africa, to one of the African countries. They built a road, a factory, and the day after they left Africa, they're gone. They're not there. We went to Africa, and after 40, 50 years, nobody knows what we're doing there and what is the main reason to be there. There is no strategy, something.
Oh, that's right. But, I think the Chinese performance in Africa got criticized for several reasons. First, when they started out, they didn't know how to work effectively with African labor. So they brought a lot of Chinese to work there. And I will tell you a story. I won't identify the country, but I had a discussion. I chair a company, and that company does business all over the world, including with Chinese companies. And so in this case, there was a proposal for the construction of a cement plant, and with this country, and my Chinese friend and partner and I met with the other country, and very quickly reached agreement in general terms about how to actually two cement plants. And my Chinese partner said, "Well, I have to build the mine for the gravel, for the stones." And they said, "Yes, you have to do that." And he said, "Okay." And then at the end of the negotiation, they said, "How long will it take you to build these two cement plants?" And my friend did a little calculation on the back of an envelope, and he said 17 months. And they said, but the French said it would take 4 years, and they wanted 3 times as much money to do it. Why would you? How can you be sure? And so my Chinese friend said, "Well, I've been to your country, and it's a lovely place. I enjoyed my time there, but we don't pay our engineers and workers by the time. We pay them by the job. So they have an incentive to do it as quickly as possible. And I'm sure they'll love your country, but they will miss their families. And we tell them you should only work 12 hours a day, and they work 16. And we tell them you should take 1 day a week off, and they refuse. And we tell them you should take a vacation once in a while, and they say, no, we want to get home." And so he said 17 months. So the problem, this is a problem, obviously, African labor is, with the exception of South Africa, and is not really as sophisticated as Asian labor. So that's a cost that has to be borne. But the Chinese have learned. They are now using many more Africans. They train them either in China or on the spot. They build good projects. Some of them are vanity projects, things like sports stadiums and government office palaces and so forth. But a lot of them are roads, railroads, projects that involve agriculture or mining or engineering. And then finally, I would just say, nobody's noticed, but there are now 3 million Chinese living in Africa. Who are they? They are small businessmen and women who have gone there. So they go to a place, Nigeria is a tough place to do business because the Nigerians are very, very smart at business. Nigeria would be very rich if they stopped focusing their brainpower on stealing from each other, which they do. But the Chinese are there, they sell textiles, they sell shoes, they sell groceries of one sort or another, and they don't intend to go home. They're raising their kids there. And they're not telling the Nigerians or the Angolans or the Kenyans or Tanzanians or anybody else how they have to organize their society. They're trying to fit in. They're not demanding special privileges. So this is quite a contrast with the history of the West in Africa, which was colonial, exploitative. I just watched a film which I recommend called Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, Soundtrack to a Coup. It's done by a Belgian director. It's a documentary of the Belgian involvement and international involvement in the Congo and the murder of Patrice Lumumba at the independence of the Congo. And it's interesting because it focuses on the involvement of African Americans in these policies or against them. And anyway, it's a brilliant film, and it is available, I think, online. And whatever you think of that period of the Cold War, it's very instructive. So I think the Chinese are not behaving like the British, French, Portuguese. The Portuguese, of course, I have to say, did an absolutely miserable job of developing the 5 colonies they had in Africa, Mozambique. I think there were two Mozambican university graduates at the time of independence, total out of the whole country. Angola, I don't, there were university graduates. Jonas Savimbi had an engineering degree from Switzerland and studied in Germany and so forth. And there were others who had studied in the Soviet Union, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, Cabo Verde. The Portuguese did very little, and the British did a fair amount. The French tried to assimilate everybody and make them into black Frenchmen, which didn't succeed. The Spanish are responsible for Guinea Equatorial, which is not the most beloved country on the planet. Anyway, and I have been in Benin and seen villas from Brazilian slave returnees who made a lot of money when they were slaves in Brazil, bought themselves their freedom, went home to, or not home, but went to a village, a city in what is now Benin, formerly Dahomey, and built villas in the Portuguese Brazilian style. And you can see these, and the descendants of these people are there. Anyway, very interesting connections across the Atlantic. But you can't say much about the West's involvement with Africa in terms of altruism. It was very exploitative.
Ambassador, you mentioned how when it comes to the natural resources of the United States and compared to the Chinese one, you've mentioned how China lacks in terms of natural resources, agriculture, energy. That's why we see the Brics coming along, and we see some sort of coalition, some sort of gathering. China, Russia, India, South Africa, and we know that Iran has joined, had UAE, and all of these countries are getting together. It
Yes,
seems to me it doesn't mean that Russia needs the other parts of BRICS the most. It seems all of them are in somehow in the same sort of position.
I think the formation of BRICS, the BRICS movement. Well, of course, the term itself was invented by a financial analyst in New York, but it actually became something. It started first as a protest movement, basically, against the United States and Europe and Western Europe, which were blocking reform in the IMF and the World Bank, and which were not providing the funds necessary for infrastructure investment, and which were essentially crippling the World Trade Organization and other organizations, and not adjusting global governance to take account of the rise of the South, or the formerly colonized countries. China, of course, semi-colonized, but the others all, in many cases, quite brutally colonized by the West. So that's how it began. It is a forum. It is not an organization. It is a place where countries can meet to discuss common policies or approaches to things. And I hope that the July 6 to 7 meeting in Brazil of the BRICS will provide ideas for alternative organizations. For example, if the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is no longer able to provide dispute settlement mechanisms because the United States has sabotaged the appeals process there, then I think it would be very advantageous for an alternative to, a parallel organization to be developed. Use the rules of the WTO. Yes, don't change them. They work pretty well, but institute something new. This is actually the model that the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank followed, and it's the model that the New Development Bank followed. And these are both offshoots of a need to meet requirements for finance that are not being met by the West. And interestingly, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, um, followed the World Bank rules right down the line. The only difference, really, was that whereas uh, if you wanted to compete for a project with World Bank money, you had to be a member of the World Bank. AIIB doesn't have that restriction. Anybody can compete. So the purpose of the AIIB is to produce infrastructure, not to enrich privileged members of its organization. So I think there are new uh, frameworks for cooperation being developed. There's a long agenda to be addressed in Rio de Janeiro and in July. I hope that happens. Um, the General Assembly of the United Nations also needs to take actions that counter the paralysis of the Security Council. I'm thinking of issues like war and peace in Palestine and possibly involvement in a resolution of the Ukraine war. I'm thinking of the IAEA taking a role, the International Atomic Energy Agency taking a constructive role in the resolution of the controversy with Iran. I think we need alternative organizations because the ones that exist do not represent the current status of decision making in the world or the distribution of power or prosperity in the world. And therefore, new institutions have to be created. And I think we're really coming to a moment like the one where the League of Nations gave way to the United Nations. The League of Nations was not able to function effectively for various reasons. The UN was an answer to that. The UN is not functioning effectively now. I think, finally, I'll just say that I think it's amazing that countries that are frustrated with the paralysis of the United Nations decision-making mechanisms, especially in the Security Council, do not organize themselves with ad hoc conferences, international conferences, where those who attend draw rules and agree to follow them. You don't have to do that through the UN. It would be wonderful if it were done through the UN because that is global, but you can do it regionally, you can do it functionally, you can do it with a part of the world, a large part of the world, and the Brics is a mechanism for doing that if people are so inclined.
If we assume that the main strategy on the part of the establishment in the United States is to make some sort of balance between the East and the West, can we consider the war in Ukraine was one of the disastrous policies of the recent decades, which would be completed if they go to war, a direct war with Iran?
Yes, I think that is the case. We proclaimed a very healthy desire, after the end of the Cold War for a Europe whole and free. But the Ukraine war has produced a Europe divided in which democracy is in retreat. So both ideologically and in security terms, it has been a disaster. Of course, it's also been a disaster for Russia to be put in a position where it felt it had to go to war over whether NATO would intrude in Ukraine or not. This was badly mishandled by both sides, I think. The Russians perhaps may be excused because when a lot of the bad things happened, they were too weak to do anything about them. But it's very hard to excuse the overextension of the West. Why, dividing Europe and perpetuating or recreating the confrontations of the Cold War was a very bad idea. And the people who have suffered the most from this, of course, are the Ukrainians. Ukraine has been depopulated, its industry destroyed, its agriculture ruined in many cases, its young men sacrificed on the battle, not so young, because there aren't very many young men in Ukraine. Their demographic pattern is they have an extremely low birth rate in Ukraine, and Ukraine's basic problems: corruption, authoritarian government, hostility to Russia, lack of adequate connections to the European Union. None of these things have been fixed. They're all there, and because Ukraine is such a mess, there are opportunities to come to a resolution of it. I noticed that President Trump is trying to hand this off to the new Pope, and I don't know whether the Pope will accept that role or not. Somebody's got to mediate, and they have to do it on a basis of realism. And the realism is that people who lose wars like ceasefires, and people who are winning wars don't want ceasefires, and therefore focusing on a ceasefire is the wrong place to focus. What you have to focus on, frankly, are the three issues the Russians have raised. What is the status of minorities in Ukraine? Can they use their own language? Can they preserve their own culture? Now, of course, the Russians have taken most of the four oblasts in the east, which are predominantly Russian-speaking. Of course, Crimea is also predominantly Russian-speaking. None of the people who live there have any desire to be under Ukrainian rule. And so to force them to be under Ukrainian rule is a violation of democracy. And Russia's not going to ask them to be under Ukrainian rule. So trying to get those territories back at the negotiating table is an exercise in futility. The two most important issues are, will there be a hostile foreign force stationed in Ukraine aimed at Russia? Russia will not tolerate that, and very understandably so. So Ukraine has to be neutral. If Ukraine is neutral, can it join the EU? Can it become a prosperous bridge as well as a buffer between the rest of Europe and Russia? If with sufficient imagination, yes. And finally, of course, we have to get rid of the confrontation in Europe. Europe really ought to be whole and free. And the only way it can become whole and free is if Russians are recognized as part of the equation and have some kind of role in the governance of Europe alongside other great powers like Germany, France, Italy, Spain. This war awaits an imaginative solution. And that solution has to be based on reality on the ground. It cannot be based on the propaganda of the West, which says that Russia's in terrible condition, it's lost 1 million men or 790,000 men or some preposterous number. Its economy is failing, which is not true. Its armaments industry can't support the war. That is also not true. I mean, many people in the West wish those things were true. They're not true. You can't conduct an effective negotiation on the basis of daydreams. You have to recognize the realities, and to date, the West has not done so. Europeans have no peace plan at all. Trump wants peace, I think, but he doesn't know how to get it. The Russians have a very clear plan, which is to start with the Istanbul Agreement that was reached in March and April of 2022. And if Ukraine won't accept that as a basis for a resolution now, the Russians have threatened they will take more land, not less.
Yeah.
This is not a good situation.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Well,
great pleasure as always.
Thank you for having me on, and you keep well.
Thank you.